Kia ora students, you should be here if you are wanting to know how to write an essay about Juno of Taris and you are in one of my Year 9 classes. So welcome to the start of all of the tutorials. This first one is all about how to actually choose a question, which is a really important skill in and of itself, even though it seems like it should be very obvious. So here we have 11 steps. Step number 1, choose a question. That's where we are at now. Please remember that when you're watching this, you can pause anytime, write down what you can see on the screen, write down a question, rewind and play something if you didn't quite understand. Or if you're in class, you can always put up your hand and ask me to come and clarify what it is that I meant when I was recording the video. When you get to the exam at the end of the year, this is very similar to what you will have in front of you. You'll have quite a few different questions to choose from, might be less, might be more, and you don't know what those questions will be until you get into the exam on the day. And that's why we have to do so many different practice essays, so that we get used to this process of planning, of actually going through the whole thing of choosing the question and then planning an essay in response to the question. So as I said just at the beginning, it's really important to know how to choose the right question for you and for the text that you are working with. So we're working with Juno of Taris. In here there are 7 questions, but not all of them are appropriate for Juno of Taris. In these tutorials I'm going to work with one question, but you can't answer that question unless you do it differently from me. That will become more obvious in a second. When I'm choosing a question, I will go with my gut reaction at first. So this is what I recommend you do. I recommend you go through and go, no, don't like that one. Nope, too hard. Confusing, doesn't work, not interested. And often you'll find you'll be left with one that is the question that you're going to work with. And that is in fact the question I'm going to work with today, but I'm not going to talk too much more about that right now. What I'm going to do is talk you through how you can make this decision on your own, but with a little bit of support from me. So question number 1 is no longer available to you unless you answer it differently from me. I'll explain that in the next tutorial. So we're just going to cross that one out. Let's have a look at the second question. Describe at least one important decision that a main character or individual had to make in the text. Explain how the decision affected the character or events throughout the text. Now, Juno makes important decisions, Vima makes important decisions, Hilto makes important decisions, so does Maba. Juno's dad makes an important decision when he firstly chooses to abandon his family but then changes his mind. So, good question. You could totally do that one. It would work really well. Question 3. Describe at least one idea that is relevant to people in today's society in the written text. Explain why the idea, as shown in the text, is relevant to people in today's... Also a good question to do. This, I think, is a more challenging question for students at Year 9. For some reason, younger students do seem to find idea that is relevant to people in today's society. They find that a little bit overwhelming, a bit confusing. But do remember, you're going to go through the whole process of working out what the question is asking you and planning your answer. And if at any point you get stuck or you're not confident with your ideas, you'll check in with me and we'll see how you're going. You can always change the question you're working with as well. Question 4. Describe at least one important setting in the written text. Explain how the setting helped to show the writer's ideas. Please note that setting is time, place, and circumstances that form the background against which characters or individuals live and act. So, is Taris an important setting? Yes, it is. Does it help to communicate Fleur Beale's ideas? Yes, it does. I strongly recommend that you do this question. I think it's a fantastic question. Students often don't discuss setting. It can be a little bit tricky, but for something like Juno of Taris, it's a very obvious thing. You know, the setting is right there. It's a huge dome and it gets described a lot and discussed a lot. And without the setting, the story would be completely different. So I recommend that one. Then basically, no, but I'll explain why. Question 5. At least one event that was a turning point. That's basically a moment in the story where something changes significantly. I think that in Juno of Taris, there are too many of those moments to choose from. That's why I don't think that's a good one to do. Describe at least one technique in the written text that help the writers show the writer's ideas. Explain how the technique shows the writer's ideas. Note, techniques could include vocabulary, imagery, style, symbolism, structure, or narrative point of view. Now, has my teaching focused on those techniques so far this year? No. We will learn about these things, but at this point in the time, you don't have that knowledge, or not confidently. The other reason why I wouldn't do it is because those types of questions really lend themselves well to poetry, where you could talk about the metaphor or the imagery or the style of the poetry. But Juno of Taris is not a poem, it's a novel, so I don't recommend you do that one. Lastly, describe at least one change that happened in the written text. Explain how the change helped you to understand one or more key ideas. Have a look at question 5. Question 5 and question 7, very similar. And so again, I don't think you can narrow it down to one change. It's not that kind of book. If you think about, say, the Hunger Games, there's an obvious change. Primrose's name is pulled out of the bowl, or they changed the rules to make it so that 2 people can win. Those kinds of things are massive changes that happen that help us to understand the novel better. But for question 5 and 7, I don't think that they work well with Juno of Taris. So what you now need to do before you watch any of the other videos is choose a question. I strongly recommend you choose from question 2, 3 or 4. You can also strategize by thinking, who do I work well with in this class, or who am I sitting next to, and what question are they going to do? I think it's a very good idea to work on the same question as your neighbour. You won't end up writing the same essay. You will plan together, ask each other questions, help each other out, and then when you get to the actual writing, of course, you'll be doing that at the same time and individually, so it's impossible to unintentionally copy from one another. And if you are intentionally copying from one another, well, that's a different problem, isn't it? So I do think it's very helpful to do the same essay as somebody that you are sitting near and feel like you can share your ideas with and that you work well with them. Note, I say work well. Don't choose somebody who is a distraction for you, and also don't choose somebody who you feel is a whole lot smarter than you are, because then you might find that you don't feel so confident when you're discussing the work together. It's a good idea when we're doing this kind of work that we work with somebody who we feel is at about the same level as us. So before you watch the next video, you should be choosing one of these 3 questions and write it down, whether you're working in your book on paper or whether you're working on a Google Doc. Doesn't matter, either way you need to write it down for yourself in the book or type it at the top of the Google Doc. I will not help you if you have not written down the question, because you can't remember the question in your head and I can't know what the question is that you're working on because I can't see inside your brain. So please write down the question and then you're ready to move on to the next video. Well done, you have completed step 1 so independently, and you are ready to move on to video number 2, all about how to work out what is that question even asking you anyway.